Some people never learn their place, do they? The words sliced through the morning air of courtroom 4C like a blade, finding bone. Judge Whitman Caldwell's voice carried the kind of authority that had been crushing spirits for 25 years, each syllable dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who believed his black robes made him untouchable. The woman standing before his bench didn't flinch. Roxanne Thornfield held her chin level, her dark eyes steady as they met his pale gray stare. She wore a simple navy blazer over pressed khakis, her natural hair pulled back in a professional bun that revealed the strong line of her jaw. No jewelry except a modest watch. No designer handbag, just a worn leather briefcase that had seen better decades. Everything about her appearance whispered ordinary citizen, yet something in her posture suggested otherwise. The Jefferson County Courthouse had witnessed thousands of such moments over its 80-year history. Defendants standing where she stood, facing judges who held their futures in contemptuous hands. But this Tuesday morning at 10:15 would be different, though no one in that packed courtroom could possibly know why. "Ma'am," Caldwell continued, his tone suggesting the word itself left a bitter taste, "you will speak only when I give you permission to speak, and I seriously doubt you understand what due process actually means in a court of law." The gallery held 12 people that morning. 3 lawyers waiting their turn, clutching manila folders and checking phones. 2 defendants scheduled for later hearings, their public defenders whispering last-minute strategies. A courthouse janitor named Samuel pausing his rounds to witness whatever drama was unfolding. And Jenny Walsh, a reporter from the Jefferson County Herald who'd come for an embezzlement hearing but found herself captivated by the tension crackling between bench and defendant. Roxanne's hands remained clasped behind her back, a stance that would have been familiar to anyone who'd spent time in prosecutors' offices. But the dozen witnesses saw only a woman in simple clothes being dressed down by a judge, whose silver hair and stern expression commanded the room like a king surveying his subjects. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying a measured calm that seemed almost unnatural given the hostility radiating from the bench. "With respect to procedural due process under the 14th Amendment." "Stop right there." Caldwell's interruption came like a gavel strike. "This is about a parking violation, ma'am. A simple parking ticket. You parked where you don't belong. It's that simple. You don't get to lecture me about constitutional law over $75. The briefcase in her left hand shifted slightly, and the edge of a manila folder became visible. Someone with sharp eyes might have noticed the partial letterhead peeking out, the distinctive seal that marked official documents. But Caldwell's attention was fixed on her face, reading defiance where others might have seen dignity. Bailiff Marcus Steele stood at his customary position beside the bench, his hand resting on his utility belt. 43 years old, 15 years in courthouse security, Marcus had seen Judge Caldwell's particular brand of justice dispensed countless times. Something about the woman nagged at his memory, like a song he'd heard before but couldn't quite place. Her voice, maybe, or the way she held herself despite the verbal assault. "Furthermore," Caldwell was saying, leaning forward with the predatory interest of a cat toying with wounded prey, "I find your attitude deeply concerning. Trying to quote federal statutes at me like you're some kind of legal scholar. That level of presumption tells me everything I need to know about your character." Public Defender Lisa Fairmont shifted in her seat at the counsel table, her conscience warring with professional survival. She'd been practicing in this courthouse for 8 years, long enough to recognize the warning signs when Caldwell decided to make an example of someone. The smart play was to stay quiet, let the storm pass, hope the collateral damage remained minimal. But watching this composed woman face such naked prejudice alone made her stomach twist. "Your Honor," Lisa ventured, rising halfway from her chair, "if I might assist?" "Sit down, Ms. Fairmont." Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip. "This defendant already has representation if she wants it. Though given what I'm seeing here, I'm not sure legal counsel would make much difference in this particular case." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Roxanne's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on her briefcase handle. Inside that beaten leather case lay documents that would turn this courtroom's power structure upside down in mere minutes. But for now, she endured. "This judge's attitude is completely unacceptable, like if you think he's wrong from the start." Alan Brightwater, the prosecutor assigned to traffic court that morning, sat at his table reviewing files and pretending not to notice the escalating tension. 28 years old, 3 years out of law school, he'd learned early that challenging Judge Caldwell was career suicide. Better to keep his head down, process the cases, and hope for a transfer to a different courtroom before his conscience completely atrophied. "The facts are simple," Caldwell announced, his voice carrying the finality of a closing argument. "You received a citation for parking in a space reserved for judicial personnel. The fine is $75 plus court costs. Your appeal claims the citation was issued in error, but I see no evidence supporting that claim. Your Honor, I have photographic evidence that clearly shows. I said the facts are simple. Caldwell's interruption came with enough force to make several gallery members jump. I don't need to see pictures. I need to see respect. And, frankly, your attitude tells me everything about your character that I need to know. Marcus found himself studying the woman more intently. Something about the way she absorbed each verbal blow, without breaking, without pleading, without the desperate scrambling he'd witnessed from hundreds of other defendants. She stood like someone accustomed to being heard, not dismissed. Like someone who expected justice, not mercy. Jenny Walsh had stopped taking notes about her scheduled case and started recording this one instead. 15 years of covering courthouse proceedings had given her an instinct for when routine business was about to become front-page news. Her phone captured every word, every gesture, every moment of what was rapidly becoming a masterclass in judicial abuse. The ticket clearly states the violation, Caldwell continued, waving a document without actually reading it. Municipal Code 15.3a, unauthorized parking in designated judicial spaces. The penalty is clearly defined. Your appeal is frivolous and wastes this court's valuable time. Roxanne took a measured breath. Your Honor, Municipal Code 15.3a specifically refers to the underground parking garage spaces marked with judicial nameplates. I was parked in Visitor Space 12 on the ground level, which is designated for official courthouse business. The photographic evidence I'm attempting to present clearly establishes. Enough! Caldwell's roar filled the courtroom like thunder. You will not lecture me about municipal codes in my courtroom. Who do you think you are? The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither man nor woman fully grasped yet. Who did she think she was? The answer to that question would reshape everything in this room, but for now it remained locked away like a secret waiting for its moment. Samuel, the janitor, paused his cleaning and watched from the back of the gallery. 62 years old, 30 years of courthouse employment, he'd seen every kind of injustice this building had to offer. But something about this particular scene made his chest tight with familiar anger. Another black woman being ground down by the system, her dignity trampled by a judge who saw her color before her humanity. I'm someone who deserves to have the evidence heard before judgment is rendered, Roxanne replied, her voice maintaining its steady calm despite the storm raging above her. That's not presumption, Your Honor, that's procedure. Caldwell's face flushed red above his white collar. In his quarter-century on the bench, he'd perfected the art of intimidation. The defendants were supposed to crumble, apologize, beg for mercy. They weren't supposed to stand there citing legal procedures like they belonged in his courtroom. Your presumption is astounding, Batata, he snarled. Absolutely astounding. You come into my courtroom, waste valuable time with a frivolous appeal, then have the audacity to lecture me about procedure. Well, let me tell you about procedure, ma'am. The procedure here is that I review the facts. I make the determination and you accept the judgment of this court. Lisa Fairmont's hands clenched in her lap. She'd watched Caldwell's prejudice play out dozens of times, but rarely this blatantly, never this publicly. The smart move was still to stay quiet, but her law school oath echoed in her memory. To seek justice above all else. The manila folder slipped another inch from Roxanne's briefcase, revealing more of the official letterhead. From his position, Marcus caught a glimpse of what looked like a government seal, federal maybe, or state level. His frown deepened as memory continued to scratch at his consciousness. The appeal is denied, Caldwell announced with the satisfaction of a man crushing something beautiful under his heel. The fine stands at $75 plus court costs of $50. Total amount due, $125. You have 30 days to pay or face additional penalties. Roxanne's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Not defeat, not fear. Something closer to disappointment, as if she'd hoped for better from an institution she'd spent her life serving. Your Honor, you haven't reviewed the evidence I'm attempting to present, she said, her voice carrying the patience of someone explaining basic concepts to a child. Due process requires... Due process? Caldwell's laugh was sharp and ugly. You want to talk about due process? I'll tell you about due process. Due process is you getting your day in court, which you're having right now. Due process is you getting to speak your piece, which I've generously allowed despite your attitude. Due process is not you telling me how to run my courtroom. The courtroom had gone silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of Jenny Walsh's pen across her notepad. Every person in that gallery was witnessing something that felt significant, though none could yet grasp the full scope of what was unfolding. Marcus shifted his weight, his hand moving reflexively toward his radio. Protocol demanded he remain neutral during hearings, But his instincts were screaming that something was deeply wrong, not just with the judge's obvious bias, but with the entire situation. The woman's composure was too perfect, her legal knowledge too precise, her bearing too authoritative for someone fighting a parking ticket. Judge Whitman Caldwell had built his reputation on what he called no-nonsense justice. Son of a prosecutor, grandson of a judge, he'd inherited both his position and his prejudices from a family that believed certain people belonged in certain places. His courtroom was his kingdom, and kingdoms required order. The natural order that put people like him in power and people like her in their place. Furthermore, Caldwell continued, his voice dropping to the tone he reserved for pronouncing sentences, I find your continued interruptions and your disrespectful attitude toward this court deeply troubling. You seem to believe that you're entitled to special treatment, that the rules that apply to everyone else somehow don't apply to you. Alan Brightwater looked up from his files, recognizing the shift in Caldwell's tone. The judge was building towards something bigger than a traffic fine. Brightwater had seen it before. The escalation, the manufactured outrage, the disproportionate punishment designed to teach lessons about knowing one's place. He should intervene. Any competent prosecutor would point out that the case involved a simple parking violation that could be resolved with a 5-minute evidence review. But intervention meant confrontation with Caldwell, and confrontation meant career consequences. Brightwater kept his mouth shut. Your Honor, Lisa Fairmont tried again, rising fully from her chair this time. I believe there may be some confusion about the parking designation. If we could just review— Ms. Fairmont! Caldwell's voice boomed across the courtroom like artillery fire. I've already warned you once. This defendant has not requested your assistance, and your continued interruptions are bordering on contempt. I suggest you focus on your own cases and allow me to handle mine. The threat was clear. Lisa sank back into her chair, her face flushed with shame and anger. Around the gallery, lawyers and defendants exchanged glances that spoke volumes about the courthouse's toxic atmosphere. This was how the system worked. Through intimidation, through fear, through the certain knowledge that crossing Caldwell meant professional destruction. Roxanne watched this interplay with the analytical eye of someone who understood power dynamics intimately. Her briefcase contained documents that would explain her unusual calm, her precise legal language, her complete lack of fear in the face of judicial tyranny. But those documents remained hidden, their revelations waiting for the right moment. You know what I think? Caldwell was saying, leaning back in his chair with the smug satisfaction of a predator toying with wounded prey. I think you came in here expecting special treatment. I think you believe that if you throw around enough legal terminology, if you act entitled enough, you can intimidate this court into giving you what you want. Jenny Walsh's pen moved faster across her notepad. This wasn't just a news story anymore, it was documentation of abuse of power happening in real time. Her editor would want quotes, context, background. But first, she needed to capture every word of what felt like a constitutional crisis unfolding in traffic court. I think, Caldwell continued, his voice gaining momentum like a train building speed, you represent everything that's wrong with today's society. No respect for authority, no understanding of proper procedure, no appreciation for the institutions that keep our communities safe and orderly. Marcus's memory finally clicked into place. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to send ice through his veins. He'd seen her face before, heard her voice, recent memory, within the past few weeks. Something about a swearing-in ceremony, a newspaper article, an announcement that had circulated through law enforcement channels. His hand moved toward his radio again, then stopped. Accusing a judge of misconduct without absolute certainty was career suicide. But if his suspicions were correct, the briefcase slipped again, this time revealing more of the official document. Marcus caught sight of what looked like an appointment letter, formal letterhead, the kind of papers that accompanied major personnel changes in the justice system. His stomach dropped as pieces began assembling into a picture too incredible to believe. However, Caldwell announced, his voice taking on the ceremonial tone of Judgment Day, I am not without mercy. Despite your attitude, despite your disrespect, I'm prepared to accept your payment and close this matter. $125, cash, check, or money order. Payable today. Roxanne's response came without hesitation, her voice carrying the same measured calm that had marked her presence from the beginning. Your Honor, I respectfully maintain that this citation was issued in error and request that you review the photographic evidence before. That's enough. Caldwell's fist struck his bench with enough force to make his nameplate jump. I have heard enough. You have been given more courtesy than you deserve, more patience than you've earned, and more time than this trivial matter warrants. Your continued refusal to accept the judgment of this court demonstrates a fundamental lack of respect for law and order." The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted from tense to electric. Even the lawyers who'd seen Caldwell's worst behavior recognized that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just judicial bias. This was a man losing control, letting his prejudices override basic legal procedure. Samuel, still watching from the back, felt the familiar weight of witnessing injustice. How many times had he seen this play out? How many black men and women had stood where she stood, facing a system designed to grind them down? But something about her refusal to break, her unwillingness to beg, gave him a flicker of hope that maybe this time would be different. Lisa Fairmont's training warred with her survival instincts. Everything she'd learned in law school screamed that this was wrong, that a defendant had the right to present evidence, that judicial bias this obvious was grounds for appeal. But everything she'd learned in practice whispered that crossing Caldwell meant professional death. Legal shield, legal protection when you need it most. Don't face the system alone. The advertisement seemed to mock the situation unfolding in courtroom 4C, where a woman was facing the system completely alone while lawyers and officers who should have been protecting her rights sat paralyzed by fear. "Your Honor," Roxanne said, her voice cutting through the tension with surgical precision, "I invoke my right under Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 11 to present evidence material to this proceeding. Your refusal to review relevant evidence may constitute reversible error under—" "Silence!" The word exploded from Caldwell's mouth with enough venom to poison the air. Several gallery members actually recoiled as if physically struck. The judge's face had gone from red to purple, his hands shaking with rage as he pointed an accusatory finger at the woman who dared to cite federal rules in his courtroom. "You will not quote federal procedures at me. You will not lecture me about reversible error. Who in the hell do you think you are?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to fate itself. Around the courtroom, people held their breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would be remembered long after the morning docket was completed. Jenny Walsh's pen raced across her notepad, capturing every word of what was becoming the most explosive story of her career. Marcus found himself taking an involuntary step forward. His fragmentary memories were coalescing into something approaching certainty. And if he was right, if his impossible suspicion was correct, then they were all witnessing a catastrophe of historic proportions. But before he could act, before anyone could intervene, Judge Whitman Caldwell leaned forward, with the smile of a man about to deliver a killing blow. "I'll tell you exactly who you are," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than his loudest shout. "You're someone who's about to learn a very expensive lesson about respect. I hereby hold you in contempt of court." The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples that would soon become waves. Judge Caldwell pronounced them with the satisfaction of a man who believed he was dispensing justice rather than revealing his own moral bankruptcy. $500 fine and 24 hours in Jefferson County detention, he continued, each word measured and deliberate, to be served immediately. The gallery erupted in a chorus of gasps and muttered protests. Jenny Walsh's phone captured the exact moment when routine courthouse business transformed into front-page scandal. Lisa Fairmont shot to her feet, her professional caution finally overwhelmed by basic human decency. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate," she called out, her voice carrying across the stunned silence. "The defendant has merely attempted to present evidence and cite applicable law. That cannot constitute contempt under any reasonable interpretation." "Ms. Fairmont!" Caldwell's roar cut her off mid-sentence. "You are now in danger of being held in contempt yourself. I suggest you remember where you are and who you're addressing." Marcus Steele felt his training pull him in opposite directions. Protocol demanded he follow the judge's orders without question, prepare the defendant for detention, process the paperwork, maintain order in the courtroom. But his growing certainty about the woman's identity made his hand tremble as he reached for his handcuffs. Roxanne stood perfectly still through the chaos, her expression unchanged. 24 hours in county jail for citing federal procedure. It wasn't the worst injustice she'd witnessed in her career, but it was certainly the most personal. Her briefcase remained at her side, its contents hidden but increasingly relevant as the situation spiraled beyond Caldwell's control. "Officer Steele," the judge commanded, his voice echoing with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, "place the defendant in custody immediately. I want her processed and transported within the hour." Marcus took one step toward the defendant's table, then stopped. Up close, her face was unmistakable. The newspaper photo from the swearing-in ceremony, the memo that had circulated through law enforcement channels, the briefing about new protocols for the district attorney's office. It all crystallized into terrifying clarity. "Judge Caldwell," he said, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "Sir, I think there might be something you should know." "I know everything I need to know, Marcus," Caldwell snapped, his patience exhausted by what he perceived as widespread insubordination. "I know that defendant has shown nothing but disrespect for this court and needs to learn about consequences. Now follow your orders." The courtroom held its collective breath as Marcus hesitated, handcuffs in hand, standing inches from a woman whose identity could transform this entire proceeding from judicial authority into judicial suicide. Around the gallery, lawyers leaned forward, sensing the electric tension of a moment balanced on a knife's edge. Roxanne looked up at the bailiff with something approaching sympathy. "It's okay, Officer Steele," she said quietly, her voice carrying a strange mix of resignation and authority. "Just follow protocol. This situation will be resolved through proper channels." The words hit Marcus like physical blows. Proper channels wasn't the language of a defendant. It was the vocabulary of someone who understood how the system worked from the inside. Someone who knew exactly which channels to use and had the authority to use them. Before Marcus could respond, the courtroom's main door opened with a squeak of hinges that seemed to echo like thunder in the tense silence. Court Clerk Rebecca Martinez hurried in, her face flushed with urgency and her phone pressed against her ear. "Judge Caldwell," she called out, slightly out of breath. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have Chief Judge Harrison on the line. He says it's urgent and relates to this morning's docket." Caldwell's face cycled through several shades of irritation. "Rebecca, I am in the middle of a contempt proceeding. Tell Judge Harrison I'll return his call during the noon recess." "Sir," Rebecca pressed, her voice trembling with nervous energy. "He specifically mentioned the new district attorney appointment and said he needed to confirm arrival schedules for courthouse orientation. He seemed quite concerned about—" "I don't care what he's concerned about," Caldwell exploded, his composure finally cracking completely. "I'm dealing with a disruptive defendant who needs to learn about respect. Tell Harrison I'll call him back." The words "new district attorney appointment" seemed to hang in the air like incense, visible and heavy with significance. Around the courtroom, people began connecting dots that had been scattered across the morning's proceedings. Marcus went pale. Lisa Fairmont's eyes widened with sudden comprehension. Even Alan Brightwater looked up from his files with dawning horror. But Caldwell, blinded by rage and 25 years of unchecked authority, remained oblivious to the catastrophe he was orchestrating. "Something big is about to be revealed. Comment your predictions." Roxanne's briefcase shifted again, this time revealing the corner of what was unmistakably an official appointment letter. The letterhead was partially visible now. Jefferson County District Attorney's Office, in formal script, followed by what looked like a signature and official seal. Samuel, the janitor, found himself moving closer to get a better view of the unfolding drama. 30 years in this courthouse had taught him to recognize the moments when justice might finally be served. And something about this woman's unshakable dignity suggested that moment might be at hand. "Officer Steele," Caldwell commanded, his voice now carrying the dangerous edge of a man whose authority was being questioned. "I gave you a direct order. Place that woman in custody or face disciplinary action yourself." Marcus looked down at the handcuffs in his trembling hands, then at the woman who stood calmly awaiting whatever came next. If his suspicions were correct, if the impossible was actually happening, then these handcuffs were about to become evidence in the biggest judicial misconduct case in county history. "Sir," he tried one more time, his voice barely above a whisper, "I really think you should take that phone call first. Chief Judge Harrison specifically mentioned—" "Marcus!" Caldwell's roar filled every corner of the courtroom. "Are you refusing a direct order? Because if you are, you can join her in contempt." The threat hung between them like a sword. Marcus had 15 years of faithful service, a spotless record, and a family that depended on his steady paycheck. But he also had eyes, and they were telling him that he was being ordered to arrest the most powerful prosecutor in the county for the crime of citing federal law. Time seemed suspended as the courtroom waited to see which way the moment would break. Would Marcus follow orders and arrest a woman he was increasingly certain held a position of authority that made this entire proceeding a constitutional nightmare? Would someone else intervene before the situation passed the point of no return? Would sanity somehow prevail in a courthouse that seemed to have lost its collective mind? Roxanne made the decision for all of them. "Officer Steele," she said, her voice cutting through the tension with the precision of a surgeon's blade, "when you complete your incident report on this detention, please ensure you spell my full name correctly. It's Roxanne Elizabeth Thornfield, Chief Prosecutor, Jefferson County District Attorney's Office." The words detonated in the courtroom like a bomb going off in a library. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Absolutely no one moved. The only sound was the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the distant murmur of traffic from the street below. Marcus dropped the handcuffs. They hit the floor with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo for hours, bouncing once before settling into stillness. His face had gone from pale to gray to something approaching green as the full magnitude of the situation crashed over him like a tsunami. "What did you just say?" Judge Caldwell's voice was barely recognizable, strained and thin, like wire stretched to its breaking point. Roxanne reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder thick with official documents. "I said Chief Prosecutor Roxanne Elizabeth Thornfield. I was sworn in this morning at 8 a.m. by Chief Judge Harrison in the main courthouse ceremony. I'm here today conducting a routine facility inspection as part of my orientation to courthouse operations." She held up an official appointment letter bearing the governor's seal, followed by a photograph of that morning's swearing-in ceremony showing her standing beside Chief Judge Harrison and several other court officials. The newspaper clipping beneath featured her photograph and the headline, "Jefferson County welcomes first black woman chief prosecutor." The silence that followed was so complete, it seemed to have physical weight. 12 people sat frozen in the gallery, watching as the most powerful judge in the building realized he'd just held the most powerful prosecutor in the county in contempt for attempting to present evidence in a routine traffic case. Rebecca Martinez, still holding the phone, spoke in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper. "Judge Harrison is still on the line, sir. He's asking if Chief Prosecutor Thornfield arrived safely for her orientation schedule." Judge Whitman Caldwell stared at the documents in Roxanne's hands as if they were written in a foreign language. His mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The color drained from his face as completely as water from a broken glass, leaving behind something that looked like a man watching his career collapse in real time. That's impossible," he whispered, though he was staring at photographic evidence that made denial pointless. "The new chief prosecutor is..." "I'm standing in your courtroom being held in contempt for citing federal procedure," Roxanne finished, her voice maintaining the same measured calm that had marked her presence from the beginning, though I suspect that situation is about to change rather dramatically. Around the courtroom, people were beginning to understand they'd just witnessed something historic. Not just a case of mistaken identity, but a complete reversal of power dynamics that would reshape everything about how justice was administered in Jefferson County. Jenny Walsh was already typing furiously on her phone, knowing she was sitting on the story of her career. Lisa Fairmont stood up slowly, her voice carrying a mixture of vindication and awe. "Your Honor, I believe Chief Prosecutor Thornfield has been trying to tell you who she is for the past 30 minutes. You've been holding the head of the district attorney's office in contempt for attempting to present evidence in a municipal parking case." The full scope of the catastrophe was finally becoming clear. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. It was career-ending, precedent-setting, front-page news for weeks misconduct. Judge Caldwell had just demonstrated every form of bias, prejudice, and abuse of power that judicial ethics rules were designed to prevent. And he'd done it all while the county's new chief prosecutor documented every word. The court clerk's phone rang again, its shrill tone cutting through the stunned silence like a fire alarm. Rebecca Martinez answered with a trembling voice that barely managed to form words. "Chief Judge Harrison?" "Yes, sir. She's here." "Yes, sir. There's been a situation." Judge Caldwell remained frozen behind his bench, staring at the appointment documents in Roxanne's hands as if they might disappear if he concentrated hard enough. The impossible had become undeniable, but his brain seemed incapable of processing the magnitude of his error. Marcus Steele stood motionless beside the fallen handcuffs, his 15-year career flashing before his eyes. He'd been ordered to arrest the chief prosecutor for citing federal law in traffic court. The absurdity would have been funny if it weren't so utterly catastrophic for everyone involved. "Sir," Rebecca continued into the phone, her voice climbing toward panic, "Chief Judge Harrison wants to speak with you immediately. He says there's been a serious misunderstanding about Chief Prosecutor Thornfield's schedule." Around the courtroom, the morning's other defendants and their attorneys watched with the fascination of people witnessing a train wreck in slow motion. What had started as routine traffic court had transformed into a constitutional crisis, and everyone present understood they were seeing something that would be discussed in law schools for decades. Alan Brightwater finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Your Honor, perhaps this case should be postponed pending..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. How do you postpone a contempt charge against the chief prosecutor? How do you walk back 25 minutes of recorded judicial bias? How do you explain to the State Judicial Commission why you sat silently while watching a career-ending display of prejudice? Jenny Walsh had abandoned all pretense of covering other stories. Her phone captured every moment, every word, every facial expression of what was rapidly becoming the most explosive story in Jefferson County's legal history. Her editor would want background, context, quotes from legal experts. But first, she needed to document the continuing implosion of Judge Whitman Caldwell. Lisa Fairmont gathered her courage and approached the bench. Your Honor, I move for immediate dismissal of all charges against Chief Prosecutor Thornfield. The contempt citation appears to have been issued without proper foundation, and the underlying parking violation has clear evidence of error. Caldwell's voice, when it finally emerged, sounded like it was being dragged up from the bottom of a well. This can't be happening. The new chief prosecutor was supposed to be. I expected someone. He stopped himself before completing the thought, but everyone in the courtroom understood what he'd been about to say. He'd expected someone who looked different. Someone who fit his preconceptions about who belonged in positions of power and who belonged in the defendant's chair. Roxanne organized her documents with practiced efficiency, each movement deliberate and professional. Your Honor, I believe we should address several issues that have emerged during this proceeding. First, the parking citation was issued in error. I have photographic evidence showing I was legally parked in a designated visitor space while conducting official business. Second, your refusal to review evidence and your immediate resort to contempt charges raise serious questions about due process in this courtroom. Samuel, the janitor, found himself smiling for the first time in years while inside the courthouse. Justice was a rare visitor to these halls, but today it seemed to be making a dramatic entrance. He'd watched too many people, especially people who looked like him, get ground down by this system. Seeing it turned upside down felt like watching the sun rise after the longest night in history. The phone conversation between Rebecca and Chief Judge Harrison had grown increasingly urgent. From her expressions and gestures, it was clear that Harrison was demanding immediate explanations for circumstances that seemed to defy rational explanation. Judge Caldwell, Rebecca said, covering the phone with her hand. Chief Judge Harrison is asking why Chief Prosecutor Thornfield wasn't escorted to his chambers as scheduled. He says her orientation appointment was at 9:30, and when she didn't arrive, he dispatched courthouse security to locate her. The timeline was becoming clear, and it painted an even more damaging picture. Roxanne hadn't been randomly appearing in traffic court. She'd been diverted there while trying to reach her official appointment. Caldwell had essentially hijacked the chief prosecutor during her first day orientation, held her in contempt, and ordered her arrested for attempting to follow legal procedure. Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, I recognized you from the law enforcement briefings about your appointment. I tried to tell the judge, but You followed your orders, Officer Steele, Roxanne replied, her tone carrying no trace of anger toward the bailiff, who'd been caught in an impossible situation. The responsibility for this proceeding lies elsewhere. Her eyes moved to Judge Caldwell, and for the first time that morning, her expression showed something beyond professional neutrality. Not anger exactly, but the cold disappointment of someone who'd spent her career believing in a system that had just revealed its ugliest face. However, she continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had made her reputation as a prosecutor, this incident raises serious concerns about the administration of justice in this courthouse. I'll be initiating a comprehensive review of sentencing patterns, case dispositions, and courtroom procedures to ensure this kind of misunderstanding doesn't happen to defendants who lack institutional power to protect themselves. The threat was delivered with surgical precision. Caldwell wasn't just facing consequences for this single incident. He was facing a complete audit of his judicial record by the most powerful prosecutor in the county. Every decision, every sentence, every display of bias would be scrutinized by someone with both the authority and the motivation to pursue justice. Identity guard, protecting your professional reputation when it matters most. Because your reputation is your career. The advertisement seemed particularly relevant as everyone in Courtroom 4C contemplated the professional wreckage that was about to unfold. Reputations that had taken decades to build were crumbling in real time, and no amount of damage control could restore what had been lost in 30 minutes of documented prejudice. Chief Judge Harrison's voice could now be heard through the phone, though the words were indistinct. Rebecca's face had gone pale as she listened to what sounded like barely controlled fury from the chief administrative officer of the entire courthouse system. Sir, she said to Caldwell, Chief Judge Harrison is coming down here immediately. He wants all parties to remain in the courtroom pending his arrival. The pronouncement felt like a death sentence. Harrison had a reputation for surgical precision in dealing with judicial misconduct, and his pending arrival meant this situation had moved far beyond local damage control. This was about to become a matter for the State Judicial Commission, the Attorney General's office, and quite possibly federal civil rights investigators. Roxanne checked her watch, the same modest timepiece she'd been wearing when this ordeal began. Your Honor, I had hoped to complete my courthouse orientation this morning and begin reviewing case assignments this afternoon. Instead, I find myself documenting what appears to be a pattern of judicial bias that may have affected hundreds of defendants who appeared in this courtroom. She gestured toward Jenny Walsh, whose phone had captured every moment of the proceeding. Ms. Walsh has been recording today's events for the Jefferson County Herald. I suspect her reporting will raise questions that extend far beyond this single case. Jenny nodded, already mentally composing headlines that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, do you plan to file formal complaints about today's treatment? I plan to follow proper procedures for addressing judicial misconduct, Roxanne replied. The State Judicial Commission exists precisely to address situations where judges exceed their authority or demonstrate bias in their proceedings. Today's events will be thoroughly documented and properly reported. Judge Caldwell seemed to shrink into his robes, the weight of consequences finally settling on his shoulders. 25 years of unchecked authority, of casual prejudice, of believing his position made him untouchable. All of it collapsing because he'd refused to see the person standing in front of him. Lisa Fairmont found her voice again, emboldened by the dramatic shift in courtroom dynamics. Your Honor, I formally request that all proceedings against Chief Prosecutor Thornfield be immediately dismissed and that a review be conducted of similar cases where defendants attempted to present evidence but were denied due process. The request carried weight now because it came in the presence of the county's most powerful prosecutor, who clearly had both the authority and the inclination to pursue systematic reform. What had seemed like career suicide an hour ago now looked like the minimum requirement for basic professional survival. Marcus bent to retrieve his fallen handcuffs, his movement slow and deliberate. 15 years of faithful service had led to this moment, being ordered to arrest the chief prosecutor for citing federal law. The absurdity would follow him for the rest of his career, assuming he still had one after today. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, he said quietly, I want you to know that I had serious concerns about this proceeding from the beginning. I tried to intervene, but you were placed in an impossible situation, Officer Steele, she replied. My concern isn't with officers following orders. It's with the judgment that created those orders in the first place. Her gaze returned to Judge Caldwell, who sat motionless behind his bench like a statue commemorating judicial arrogance. The man who had commanded this courtroom like a personal kingdom was learning that kingdoms could fall in the span of a single morning, especially when their foundations were built on prejudice rather than justice. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the hallway outside, measured and purposeful. Chief Judge Harrison was coming, and with him would come consequences that extended far beyond a simple parking ticket. What had started as routine traffic court was about to become a landmark case in judicial accountability. Roxanne organized her documents one final time, preparing for what she knew would be a lengthy afternoon of explanations, investigations, and institutional reform. Her first day as chief prosecutor hadn't gone according to schedule, but it had certainly established her priorities for the months ahead. The courtroom held its collective breath as those footsteps drew closer, everyone understanding that they were about to witness either justice or damage control, accountability or institutional protection. Either way, Courtroom 4C would never be the same again. The door opened and the future walked in. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom 4C burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Chief Judge Theodore Harrison strode into the chaos like a general entering a battlefield, his presence instantly commanding every eye in the room. At 68, Harrison possessed the kind of authority that came not from title alone, but from 4 decades of unwavering integrity and service to justice. His steel-gray hair was perfectly groomed despite the obvious haste of his arrival, and his black robes seemed to carry more weight than those of any other judge in the building. Behind him followed 2 courthouse security officers and legal administrator Patricia Wells, their faces grim with the knowledge that they were witnessing a constitutional crisis in real time. Judge Caldwell remained frozen behind his bench, the appointment document still visible in Roxanne's hands like evidence of his professional execution. The color had drained from his face so completely that he resembled a wax figure, pale and lifeless in his high-backed chair. What in God's name is happening in my courthouse? Harrison's voice filled every corner of the room, not with volume but with the kind of authority that made grown men confess their sins. His eyes swept the scene methodically, the fallen handcuffs beside Marcus, the documents in Roxanne's hands, the reporter frantically typing on her phone, the gallery full of witnesses to whatever catastrophe had unfolded. Rebecca Martinez, still clutching the phone that had started this revelation, stepped forward with trembling hands. Chief Judge Harrison, I tried to explain about Chief Prosecutor Thornfield's orientation schedule, but Judge Caldwell was— I can see exactly what Judge Caldwell was doing, Harrison interrupted, his gaze fixed on Roxanne with an expression that mixed profound apology with barely controlled fury. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, I offer my sincere apologies for this irregularity in your first day orientation. I trust you weren't seriously inconvenienced by this administrative confusion. The careful word choice wasn't lost on anyone present. Administrative confusion rather than judicial misconduct. Inconvenienced rather than subjected to racial bias. Harrison was already managing damage control while gathering information, a skill honed through decades of protecting the courthouse's reputation. Roxanne straightened to her full height, every inch the prosecutor who had built her reputation on methodical pursuit of justice. Chief Judge Harrison, I appreciate your concern. However, I believe this situation extends beyond administrative confusion. What I've witnessed in the past hour raises serious questions about due process, judicial bias, and the equal administration of justice in this courthouse. She held up the appointment documents that had triggered the morning's revelation, then gestured toward Jenny Walsh's phone. Ms. Walsh has been documenting the entire proceeding for the Jefferson County Herald. The public record will show that I was held in contempt of court for citing federal procedure, denied the right to present evidence, and subjected to what can only be described as judicial prejudice based on my appearance. Harrison's jaw tightened imperceptibly. This wasn't going to be contained with apologies and administrative reshuffling. The new chief prosecutor was drawing lines in the sand, establishing that her first day would not be forgotten or swept under the courthouse's carpet of institutional protection. Judge Caldwell, Harrison said, his voice dropping to a tone that had made careers tremble for 40 years. I believe you have something to say to Chief Prosecutor Thornfield. Caldwell's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. Around the courtroom, people leaned forward to witness what promised to be either the most abject apology in judicial history or the most spectacular display of arrogance ever recorded. I didn't know, Caldwell finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the courtroom's ventilation system. She never identified herself properly. I couldn't have known that she was what, Judge Caldwell? Roxanne's voice cut through his stammering with surgical precision. That she was the chief prosecutor? Or that she was someone deserving of basic judicial courtesy and due process? The question hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Everyone present understood that Caldwell's answer would determine whether this became a story about mistaken identity or a story about systematic judicial racism. Lisa Fairmont found her voice, emboldened by the presence of the chief judge and the obvious shift in courtroom power dynamics. Chief Judge Harrison, I was present for the entire proceeding. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield repeatedly attempted to identify herself and cite relevant law. Judge Caldwell refused to allow her to speak and escalated to contempt charges when she persisted in trying to present evidence. Marcus Steele stepped forward, his 15-year record of faithful service giving him courage he'd never possessed before this moment. Sir, I recognize Chief Prosecutor Thornfield from the law enforcement briefings about her appointment. I tried to inform Judge Caldwell, but he ordered me to proceed with the arrest anyway. The bailiff's statement hit the courtroom like lightning. This wasn't just about mistaken identity or poor communication. This was about a judge who had been warned about the defendant's identity and chose to proceed with judicial persecution anyway. Alan Brightwater, who had remained silent throughout the morning's escalating crisis, finally spoke up. Chief Judge Harrison, as the prosecuting attorney assigned to this courtroom, I feel compelled to state that the parking citation appears to have been issued in error. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield has photographic evidence that Judge Caldwell refused to review. Harrison's expression grew darker with each revelation. This wasn't administrative confusion. This was a pattern of deliberate misconduct that had occurred in front of multiple witnesses, been recorded by the press, and involved the systematic denial of due process to the county's new chief prosecutor. Jenny Walsh raised her hand tentatively. Chief Judge Harrison, I'm Jenny Walsh from the Jefferson County Herald. I've been recording today's proceedings. Would you like to make a statement about the courthouse's position on what we've witnessed? The question was masterfully crafted. Harrison had to choose between throwing Caldwell under the bus immediately or appearing to endorse judicial racism on the public record. Either choice would define how this story played out in the media. Ms. Walsh, Harrison replied carefully, the Jefferson County Courthouse is committed to the equal administration of justice for all citizens, regardless of their background or appearance. When that commitment is not met, we take immediate and decisive action to address the situation. He turned to face Judge Caldwell directly, his expression hardening into something that belonged in a criminal sentencing hearing. Judge Caldwell, you will immediately dismiss all charges against Chief Prosecutor Thornfield. You will then report to my chambers for a complete review of today's proceedings and their implications for your continued service on this bench. Caldwell's hands shook as he reached for his gavel. The contempt charge is hereby dismissed, he stammered, each word seeming to cause him physical pain. The parking citation is dismissed pending review of evidence. Furthermore, Harrison continued relentlessly, you will formally apologize to Chief Prosecutor Thornfield for the treatment she received in your courtroom, and you will cooperate fully with any investigation that may result from today's events. The formal apology requirement was a masterstroke. It forced Caldwell to acknowledge wrongdoing on the public record while creating documentary evidence for future proceedings. No amount of later damage control could undo words spoken in open court and recorded by the press. Caldwell stood shakily behind his bench, his 25 years of judicial authority evaporating like morning mist. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, he began, his voice cracking with each syllable. I sincerely apologize for the treatment you received in my courtroom today. Your rights were not properly respected, and I was wrong to proceed without fully understanding the situation. Roxanne studied him with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent her career evaluating the sincerity of defendants and witnesses. Judge Caldwell, I accept your apology. However, my concern extends beyond my personal treatment today. How many other defendants have stood where I stood and faced similar prejudice without the institutional power to defend themselves? The question struck the courtroom's heart like an arrow finding its target. This wasn't just about one incident. This was about a pattern of behavior that had likely affected hundreds of defendants over the course of Caldwell's career. Samuel, the courthouse janitor, felt tears in his eyes for the first time in years while at work. How many people who looked like him had faced Caldwell's prejudice without recourse? How many had been ground down by a system that saw their skin color before their humanity? Today, finally, someone with power was asking the right questions. Harrison recognized the broader implications immediately. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield raises an important point. I'm ordering an immediate review of sentencing patterns, case dispositions, and contempt citations in this courtroom for the past 5 years. This office is committed to ensuring that justice is administered equally, regardless of the defendant's background. Patricia Wells, the legal administrator, stepped forward with her tablet ready. Chief Judge Harrison, I can begin compiling the data immediately. We'll need to examine demographic patterns in sentencing, plea agreements, and procedural rulings. The scope of the coming investigation was becoming clear. This wasn't going to be a quiet internal review. This was going to be a comprehensive audit that would likely expose patterns of bias affecting hundreds of cases. The story was growing from courthouse scandal to potential civil rights investigation. This moment changes everything. Share if you believe justice should be truly blind to everything except the truth. Roxanne gathered her documents with practiced efficiency, every movement reflecting the prosecutorial mindset that had made her reputation. Chief Judge Harrison, I appreciate your swift action on this matter. However, I want to make it clear that I expect no special treatment because of my position. This investigation should examine the treatment of all defendants, with particular attention to those who lacked the institutional power to defend themselves against judicial bias. The statement was both magnanimous and strategically brilliant. By refusing special treatment, she positioned herself as a champion of all defendants while ensuring that the investigation would be comprehensive rather than focused solely on her personal experience. Lisa Fairmont approached the bench with renewed confidence. Chief Judge Harrison, as someone who has practiced in this courtroom for 8 years, I can provide extensive documentation of concerning patterns in judicial decision-making. Many of my colleagues in the Public Defender's Office have similar observations. The offer was another nail in Caldwell's professional coffin. If public defenders were willing to go on record about judicial bias, it meant they were no longer afraid of retaliation. The fear that had protected Caldwell's reign of prejudice was evaporating in real time. Marcus looked down at the handcuffs he still held, then at Chief Judge Harrison. Sir, I request permission to file a supplemental report about today's events. There were aspects of this proceeding that troubled me from a law enforcement perspective. Even the bailiff was distancing himself from Caldwell's actions. The judge's isolation was becoming complete as everyone who had witnessed his misconduct lined up to provide evidence against him. Harrison nodded grimly. Officer Steele, you'll file a complete report with courthouse security. Ms. Fairmont, you'll coordinate with our legal administrator to provide documentation. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, I'll need a formal statement about today's events for our records. The bureaucratic machinery of accountability was grinding into motion, each procedure another step toward comprehensive reform. This wasn't just about punishing one judge. This was about rebuilding trust in a system that had clearly failed its fundamental obligations. Caldwell remained standing behind his bench like a condemned man awaiting execution. 25 years of unchecked authority, of casual cruelty disguised as judicial efficiency, of believing his robes made him untouchable, all of it crumbling because he'd been unable to see the person standing in front of him. "Your Honor," Rebecca Martinez said quietly, "your remaining docket for today includes 17 cases. Should we postpone pending this investigation?" Harrison considered the question carefully. Postponing would signal institutional crisis, but proceeding might suggest business as usual despite obvious misconduct. "We'll adjourn this courtroom for the remainder of the day. Cases will be rescheduled pending assignment of interim judicial coverage." The decision sealed Caldwell's fate. He wasn't just being investigated, he was being removed from active duty while that investigation proceeded. His career had effectively ended the moment Roxanne revealed her identity, though the formal proceedings would take months to complete. Jenny Walsh had filled dozens of pages with notes and quotes that would dominate news cycles for weeks. "Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, how do you plan to address systematic bias in your new position?" "Ms. Walsh, my office will be implementing comprehensive reforms designed to ensure equal justice for all defendants. We'll be reviewing conviction patterns, plea agreement disparities, and sentencing recommendations to identify and eliminate any trace of bias in our prosecutorial decisions." The answer was both a promise to the public and a warning to anyone in the prosecutor's office who might have been comfortable with the old system of unequal justice. Change was coming, and it would be thorough. Harrison checked his watch, calculating the administrative nightmare that this single morning had created. "Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, I believe we should postpone your remaining orientation activities and schedule a private meeting to discuss the implications of today's events for courthouse operations." "Chief Judge Harrison, I appreciate the offer, but I'd prefer to complete my scheduled orientation activities. This incident, while unfortunate, shouldn't derail the important work of this office. Justice delayed is justice denied, regardless of the circumstances." Her refusal to be sidetracked by Caldwell's misconduct sent a clear message to everyone present. She wasn't going to let judicial racism define her first day or distract from her mission to reform the prosecutor's office. The work continued regardless of obstacles. Samuel began gathering his cleaning supplies, but his movements were slower than usual. He wanted to witness every moment of this historic morning, to see justice finally being served after 30 years of watching it denied to people who looked like him. NAACP Legal Defense Fund, fighting for justice and equality in courtrooms across America. Because everyone deserves equal protection under law. The advertisement seemed perfectly timed as Courtroom 4C witnessed the kind of institutional accountability that civil rights organizations had been demanding for generations. Real change was happening, documented and undeniable, in front of witnesses who would remember this day for the rest of their lives. Patricia Wells had already begun making notes on her tablet, calculating the resources needed for a comprehensive review of 5 years of judicial decisions. "Chief Judge Harrison, this investigation will likely require external oversight to ensure credibility. Should we contact the State Judicial Commission immediately?" Harrison nodded grimly. "Patricia, contact the Commission and the State Attorney General's office. This situation requires transparency that only external oversight can provide." The decision meant this would become a state-level investigation with potential federal implications. Caldwell wasn't just facing internal discipline. He was facing the full weight of state judicial accountability measures and possible federal civil rights investigations. Roxanne organized her briefcase one final time, preparing to leave the courtroom where her career as chief prosecutor had begun in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. "Ladies and gentlemen, what happened here today demonstrates both the worst and best of our justice system. Judicial bias is real, but institutional accountability is also real. Today, accountability won." She turned toward the gallery, addressing everyone present with the authority of someone who had just transformed from defendant to prosecutor in front of their eyes. "To anyone who has faced similar treatment in any courtroom, know that your experiences matter. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied." The promise resonated through the courtroom like a pledge of allegiance to a new kind of justice. This wasn't just about reforming one courthouse. This was about fundamentally changing how power was exercised in the American legal system. As Roxanne walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the marble floor with measured authority, every person in that courtroom understood they had witnessed something transformative. Not just the fall of an arrogant judge, but the rise of a justice system that might actually live up to its promises of equal treatment under law. The news of Judge Caldwell's spectacular downfall spread through the Jefferson County Courthouse like wildfire consuming dried timber. By noon, every lawyer, clerk, bailiff, and janitor in the building had heard some version of the story. By 2 o'clock, the tale had reached the county commissioners, the mayor's office, and the governor's legal counsel. By evening, it would be trending on social media with hashtags that would define conversations about judicial reform for months to come. Jenny Walsh's first article hit the Jefferson County Herald's website at 1:15 p.m. with a headline that immediately went viral. Judge holds new black chief prosecutor in contempt over parking ticket. Exclusive courthouse footage reveals pattern of judicial bias. Within minutes, her phone was ringing with interview requests from national news networks, civil rights organizations, and legal scholars who recognized the story's broader implications. 3 months later, the consequences of that Tuesday morning in Courtroom 4C had reshaped the entire landscape of Jefferson County's justice system. The State Judicial Commission's investigation, led by retired federal judge Maria Santos and civil rights attorney Nathan Blake, had examined 5 years of Judge Caldwell's decisions with the methodical precision of forensic accountants. Their preliminary findings, released in a 200-page report that made front-page news across the state, revealed patterns of bias so systematic they bordered on the mathematical. Sentencing disparities based on defendant race exceeded 400% for nonviolent offenses. Contempt of court citations were issued against minority defendants at a ratio of 9-to-1 compared to white defendants facing similar charges. Requests for court-appointed counsel were denied for minority defendants at twice the rate of white defendants with identical financial circumstances. The numbers painted a picture of judicial prejudice so comprehensive that even Caldwell's defenders, and there were fewer each day, struggled to find alternative explanations. Judge Caldwell himself had aged a decade in 3 months. The silver-haired man who had once commanded Courtroom 4C with imperial arrogance now spent his days in a modest downtown law office, attempting to rebuild a private practice after his forced resignation from the bench. His application for early retirement had been denied by the State Retirement Board pending completion of the bias investigation. His law license remained under review by the State Bar Association. His legacy had been reduced to a cautionary tale about unchecked judicial power. The morning of his resignation hearing, Caldwell had stood in the same courtroom where his career had imploded, facing a panel of judges who had once considered him a colleague. His resignation letter, read aloud by Chief Judge Harrison, contained the kind of carefully lawyered language that admitted wrongdoing without accepting legal liability. I recognize that my judicial decisions may not have reflected the equality and fairness that citizens deserve from their court system, the letter read. While I maintain that my intentions were never discriminatory, I understand that impact matters more than intent when constitutional rights are at stake. The resignation had been accepted immediately, along with a recommendation that Caldwell never again seek judicial appointment in any jurisdiction. But the real transformation of Jefferson County's justice system was happening in Chief Prosecutor Roxanne Thornfield's office, where comprehensive reform had become the order of every day. The Conviction Integrity Unit that Roxanne established in her first week had grown into a 20-person division that reviewed every felony conviction and significant misdemeanor case from the past decade, working in partnership with the Public Defender's Office, a collaboration that would have been unthinkable under the previous administration. The CIU had identified 237 cases requiring immediate review. 47 convictions had been overturned entirely due to prosecutorial misconduct, inadequate defense representation, or judicial bias. 63 sentences had been reduced following evidence that original penalties were disproportionately harsh based on defendant demographics. 18 defendants who had served time for crimes they didn't commit were formally exonerated and awarded compensation from a fund established by the county commissioners. The changes went beyond individual case reviews. Roxanne had implemented data-driven prosecution policies that required statistical justification for charging decisions, plea agreement terms, and sentencing recommendations. Every prosecutor in the office attended monthly training on implicit bias, constitutional rights, and ethical obligations. Performance evaluations now included measures of fairness and community trust, not just conviction rates. Lisa Fairmont, whose courage in Courtroom 4C had helped expose the system's failures, found herself appointed as the new Director of Defendant Services, a position created to ensure adequate representation for all defendants regardless of their ability to pay for private counsel. Her first initiative was establishing a rapid response protocol for cases involving potential judicial bias, ensuring that future defendants wouldn't face Caldwell's prejudice alone. Marcus Steele, the bailiff who had recognized Roxanne but been too intimidated to act decisively, became head of the courthouse's new Justice Oversight Committee. His 15 years of witnessing courtroom dynamics from the bailiff's position made him uniquely qualified to identify early warning signs of judicial misconduct. The committee's monthly reports to Chief Judge Harrison included anonymous feedback from courthouse staff about concerning patterns in judicial behavior. Even Alan Brightwater, whose silence during Caldwell's display of bias had nearly ended his career, found redemption through service. After 6 months of intensive training on civil rights law and prosecutorial ethics, he became one of the most effective attorneys in Roxanne's Conviction Integrity Unit. His guilt over his past complicity driving him to work longer hours and pursue justice more aggressively than any of his colleagues. The reforms extended beyond personnel changes to systematic overhauls of courthouse culture. Chief Judge Harrison, working with Roxanne and a citizen oversight committee, had implemented new protocols requiring video recording of all proceedings, quarterly bias training for all courthouse personnel, and fast-track appeal processes for defendants claiming discriminatory treatment. The physical changes were equally symbolic. Courtroom 4C, where Caldwell had dispensed his particular brand of prejudiced justice for 25 years, was completely renovated. The imposing judicial bench was lowered to reduce the intimidation factor for defendants. Large windows were installed to flood the space with natural light, eliminating the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized judicial proceedings under Caldwell's reign. The nameplate outside the door now read, Juan Maria Santos presiding, the first Latina judge in Jefferson County history, appointed specifically because of her reputation for fairness and community engagement. Judge Santos, who had led the investigation into Caldwell's misconduct, brought a dramatically different approach to judicial administration. Her first initiative was establishing Community Justice Days, where citizens could observe court proceedings and participate in discussion about how the justice system served their neighborhoods. Her sentences for nonviolent offenses emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, with court-supervised community service replacing jail time whenever possible. The ripple effects of that Tuesday morning had spread far beyond Jefferson County's borders. The case study of institutional reform following documented bias had been adopted as a model by 12 other counties across 3 states. Law schools were teaching courses based on the Thornfield Protocol for systematic bias elimination. Civil rights organizations were using Jefferson County's transformation as proof that meaningful reform was possible when institutions chose accountability over protection of their reputations. Jenny Walsh, whose reporting had turned a courthouse scandal into a national conversation about judicial reform, won the State Press Association's Investigative Reporting Award for her comprehensive coverage of the story's aftermath. Her follow-up series, Justice After Caldwell, documented not just the institutional changes, but the human impact of reform on defendants who finally received fair treatment in Jefferson County courts. Subscribe for more stories where courage meets consequence and accountability triumphs over arrogance. The invitation seemed particularly relevant as viewers witnessed the long-term impact of one woman's refusal to accept injustice quietly. The most significant change, however, was less visible but more profound. The culture of fear that had dominated Jefferson County's courthouse for decades, the unspoken understanding that challenging judicial authority meant career suicide, had been replaced by an expectation of accountability that empowered everyone from senior attorneys to courthouse janitors to speak up when they witnessed misconduct. Samuel, the janitor whose 30-year career had been spent watching injustice unfold without recourse, found himself serving on the Citizen Oversight Committee that monitored courthouse operations. His perspective as someone who had witnessed countless proceedings from the background provided insights that legal professionals often missed. His monthly reports to Chief Judge Harrison included observations about which judges treated all defendants with equal respect and which ones might be developing concerning patterns. The transformation wasn't limited to criminal justice. Family court, traffic court, and civil proceedings all benefited from the new culture of accountability and fairness. Judges throughout the courthouse system understood that their decisions were being monitored not just by supervisors but by community members who expected equal treatment under law. Rebecca Martinez, the court clerk whose phone call had started the revelation process, was promoted to Chief Administrative Officer for the courthouse, with specific responsibility for ensuring that procedural irregularities like Caldwell's contempt citation were flagged immediately. Her new protocols required supervisory review of any contempt charges issued without clear procedural justification, eliminating the possibility of judges using contempt as a weapon against defendants they disliked. The financial impact of reform was substantial but ultimately positive for the county. While the initial costs of investigation, personnel changes, and case reviews exceeded $2 million, the long-term savings from reduced incarceration rates, lower recidivism, and improved community trust in the justice system more than offset the investment. Property values in neighborhoods that had been disproportionately affected by biased policing and prosecution began to rise as residents gained confidence that they would be treated fairly by law enforcement. More importantly, the human cost of the old system, measured in lives disrupted by discriminatory prosecution and families destroyed by excessive sentences, was being systematically reduced through policies that prioritized rehabilitation over retribution and community healing over punishment. The success of Jefferson County's reforms attracted national attention from criminal justice researchers, civil rights advocates, and government officials seeking replicable models for institutional change. Roxanne found herself testifying before congressional committees, speaking at law school conferences, and consulting with prosecutors' offices in major metropolitan areas that wanted to implement similar reforms. But perhaps the most meaningful validation of the transformation came from an unexpected source: Judge Whitman Caldwell himself. 6 months after his resignation, Caldwell requested a private meeting with Roxanne in her office. The man who had once commanded a courtroom like a personal kingdom appeared diminished and genuinely remorseful as he sat across from the woman he had tried to jail for citing federal law. "Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, Tatan," he began, his voice carrying none of the arrogant authority that had characterized their first meeting, "I want you to know that I've spent the past 6 months in intensive counseling, trying to understand how I became the kind of judge who could treat you the way I did." Roxanne listened without interruption as Caldwell described his journey from entitled judicial authority to genuine self-reflection. He had enrolled in bias recognition training, volunteered with community organizations serving populations he had disproportionately punished, and begun therapy to address the underlying attitudes that had shaped his judicial decisions. "I can't undo the damage I caused," he continued, "but I want to be part of the solution. I'm working with the State Judicial Training Commission to develop mandatory bias recognition programs for all new judges. If you're willing, I'd like to include our story as a case study in why judicial humility and self-awareness are essential to fair administration of justice." The request was both surprising and symbolically powerful. Caldwell's willingness to use his own misconduct as a teaching tool demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to ensuring that future judges learned from his failures rather than repeating them. Roxanne considered the proposal carefully. Allowing Caldwell to participate in judicial training carried risks. It might be perceived as rehabilitation rather than accountability, forgiveness rather than justice. But it also offered the possibility of preventing similar misconduct through education based on documented failure. "Judge Caldwell," she replied after a long pause, "I appreciate your willingness to acknowledge harm and work toward prevention of future bias. However, any participation in judicial training must be structured carefully to ensure that the focus remains on systemic reform rather than individual redemption." The conversation that followed established parameters for Caldwell's limited involvement in bias training programs. He would participate as a case study subject rather than an instructor, sharing his experience while legal and civil rights experts provided analysis and context. His story would be used to illustrate the institutional changes necessary to prevent judicial misconduct rather than to suggest that individual apologies were sufficient responses to systematic bias. The agreement represented a complex form of restorative justice that acknowledged both the harm caused by discriminatory judicial decisions and the possibility of learning from documented failures to prevent future misconduct. 2 years after that transformative Tuesday morning in Courtroom 4C, Jefferson County had become a national model for criminal justice reform. The changes initiated by Roxanne Thornfield's first day as chief prosecutor had evolved into comprehensive systematic transformation that touched every aspect of how justice was administered in the county. The statistics told a compelling story of institutional change. Racial disparities in sentencing had been reduced by 67% for nonviolent offenses and 43% for violent crimes. The use of excessive contempt citations had dropped by 92% across all courtrooms. Conviction rates remained high for serious crimes, while dismissal rates for questionable charges had increased substantially, indicating more careful evaluation of evidence and more ethical prosecution decisions. But the numbers only captured part of the transformation. The real change was evident in the daily operations of a courthouse system that had learned to prioritize fairness over efficiency and community trust over conviction statistics. Chief Prosecutor Roxanne Thornfield stood in her corner office on the building's top floor, looking down at the courthouse steps where citizens entered seeking justice. The view reminded her daily of the responsibility she carried, not just to prosecute crimes effectively, but to ensure that prosecution served the broader cause of community safety and healing. Her desk held 3 items that symbolized the journey from that morning in courtroom 4C to her current position as a nationally recognized criminal justice reformer. The first was a framed copy of the parking ticket that had started everything, now displayed with the notation, "Dismissed, issued in error," stamped across it in red ink. The second was a photograph from her swearing-in ceremony, showing her surrounded by family, colleagues, and community leaders who had supported her appointment. The third was a handwritten letter from a young black man whose conviction had been overturned by the Conviction Integrity Unit, thanking her for giving him back his future. Each item represented a different aspect of her mission: the personal experience of bias that had motivated her commitment to reform, the institutional support necessary for systematic change, and the human impact of justice fairly administered. A knock on her door interrupted her reflection. Lisa Fairmont entered with a stack of files representing the week's case reviews, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose daily work aligned with her deepest values. "Chief Prosecutor, we have updates on 3 major cases," Lisa began, settling into the chair across from Roxanne's desk. "The Morrison conviction has been officially overturned. DNA evidence excluded by the original judge would have established reasonable doubt. The Williams plea agreement is being renegotiated based on evidence that the original sentence was disproportionately harsh compared to similar cases involving white defendants. And the Jackson case has been dismissed entirely due to prosecutorial misconduct by the previous administration." Each case represented not just individual justice, but systematic recognition that the old way of doing business had been fundamentally flawed. The Conviction Integrity Unit's work wasn't just about correcting past mistakes. It was about demonstrating the kind of careful, ethical prosecution that should have been standard practice all along. "How is Mr. Morrison adjusting to his release?" Roxanne asked, remembering the man who had served 3 years for a crime he hadn't committed. "Better than expected. The county's compensation program covered his lost wages and provided funding for vocational training. He's enrolled in community college and working part-time while he rebuilds his life. He asked me to tell you that he doesn't harbor anger toward the system. He's grateful that it eventually worked the way it was supposed to." The response was both humbling and encouraging. Morrison's forgiveness demonstrated the kind of community healing that was possible when institutions acknowledged mistakes and worked to repair harm rather than defending their reputations. Marcus Steele appeared in the doorway, his role as Justice Oversight Committee Chair having transformed him from a silent observer of courtroom proceedings to an active advocate for procedural fairness. "Chief Prosecutor, I have the monthly report on judicial performance indicators. Overall, the trends continue to be positive." He entered and placed a tablet on Roxanne's desk, displaying charts that tracked everything from sentencing patterns to defendant satisfaction surveys. The data showed consistent improvement across all measures of fairness and community trust. "Any areas of concern?" Roxanne asked, knowing that vigilance was essential to maintaining the reforms they had implemented. "Judge Patterson in traffic court seems to be developing a pattern of harsher sentences for defendants with public defenders compared to those with private attorneys. It's not as pronounced as what we saw with Judge Caldwell, but it's worth monitoring." The report demonstrated the value of systematic oversight, rather than waiting for dramatic misconduct to emerge. The new system identified concerning trends early and addressed them through training, mentorship, and if necessary, reassignment of judicial responsibilities. "I'll speak with Chief Judge Harrison about additional training opportunities for Judge Patterson," Roxanne decided. Prevention is always preferable to remediation. Jenny Walsh arrived for her scheduled interview, 2 years of covering Jefferson County's transformation having established her as the definitive chronicler of institutional reform. Her upcoming book, Justice Delayed: How One Morning Changed American Courtrooms, would document not just the events in courtroom 4C, but their broader implications for criminal justice reform nationwide. "Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, thank you for agreeing to this follow-up interview," Jenny began, setting up her recording equipment. 2 years later, how do you assess the impact of reforms implemented since that morning in Judge Caldwell's courtroom? Roxanne considered the question carefully. The temptation was to focus on statistics and policy changes, but the real measure of success was whether justice was being administered more fairly to everyone who encountered the system. "Jenny, the most important change isn't visible in our conviction rates or our budget allocations. It's in the expectation of fairness that now characterizes every interaction in this courthouse. Defendants know they'll be heard. Defense attorneys know they can advocate vigorously without fearing retaliation. Prosecutors know they're expected to seek justice, not just convictions. That cultural change is the foundation that makes all our other reforms possible. The answer reflected Roxanne's understanding that lasting change required more than policy adjustments. It required fundamental shifts in how people understood their roles and responsibilities within the justice system. What about critics who argue that your reforms have made prosecution less effective? Jenny pressed, referencing conservative voices who claimed that fairness initiatives had weakened law enforcement. The data doesn't support that criticism, Roxanne replied firmly. Our conviction rates for serious violent crimes have actually increased because we're focusing our resources on cases where evidence is strong and prosecution serves clear public safety goals. We're not pursuing questionable cases to boost statistics, which means when we do prosecute, juries trust that we have compelling evidence of guilt. The response illustrated a key insight from Jefferson County's reform experience. Ethical prosecution was often more effective prosecution because it built community trust and jury confidence in the system's integrity. Samuel, now in his third year as a Citizen Oversight Committee member, stopped by to deliver his monthly report on courthouse accessibility and community engagement. At 65, retirement eligible but choosing to continue working, he had become an unexpected voice for institutional accountability. "Chief Prosecutor," he said, handing her a folder thick with observations and recommendations. "The community forums continue to draw good attendance. People want to understand how their justice system works, and they're generally satisfied with the changes they're seeing." Samuel's role in reform efforts had been particularly meaningful because his 30 years of courthouse employment gave him credibility with both staff and community members. His insights bridged the gap between institutional knowledge and lived experience of systematic bias. "Any specific concerns from this month's forums?" Roxanne asked, knowing that community feedback was essential for identifying problems that might not be visible from inside the system. A few families mentioned that some officers are still using harsh language during arrests, even when people are cooperative. It's not systematic, but it suggests we might need additional training on community policing approaches. The observation demonstrated the interconnected nature of criminal justice reform. Changes in prosecution policies had to be accompanied by parallel reforms in policing practices to achieve systematic improvement in how people experienced the justice system. Justice Reform Foundation supporting community-based solutions to systematic inequality. Because real change starts with institutional accountability. The advertisement reflected the broader movement that Jefferson County's transformation had helped inspire, with communities across the country demanding similar accountability from their local justice systems. Chief Judge Harrison joined the group for what had become a monthly coordination meeting between the various reform initiatives. His leadership in managing institutional change had been crucial to the success of systematic reform efforts. "Colleagues," he began, settling into his customary chair with the satisfaction of someone whose career had found renewed purpose in service of justice. "I have updates from the State Judicial Commission on implementation of bias prevention protocols in other jurisdictions." He opened a folder containing reports from 12 counties that had adopted elements of Jefferson County's reform model. The early results are encouraging. Counties that have implemented comprehensive bias training, community oversight, and data-driven decision-making are seeing significant improvements in both community trust and equitable case outcomes. The statewide adoption of Jefferson County's innovations represented validation that their approach could be successfully replicated in different communities with varying demographics and resources. "What about resistance from judges who prefer the old system?" Lisa asked, remembering the institutional protection that had shielded judicial misconduct for decades. "There's been some pushback, Harrison acknowledged, but the state Supreme Court's endorsement of our protocols has made resistance difficult to maintain. Judges understand that accountability is the new standard and most are adapting accordingly." The state-level support had been crucial for sustaining reforms beyond the initial enthusiasm for change. Without institutional backing from higher courts and state officials, local reform efforts could be undermined by judges who preferred the previous system of minimal oversight. Roxanne's phone chimed with a text message from an unexpected source, Judge Whitman Caldwell. Since their conversation about his participation in judicial training programs, he had occasionally updated her on his efforts to contribute constructively to bias prevention initiatives. The message read, "Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, the judicial training session went well today. 12 new judges from across the state participated in case study analysis of our courtroom interaction. Feedback suggests the program is effective in helping judges recognize unconscious bias patterns. Thank you for allowing me to contribute to solutions rather than just being remembered for problems." The text represented the complex legacy of that Tuesday morning in courtroom 4C. Caldwell's misconduct had been inexcusable, but his willingness to participate in preventing similar failures by future judges demonstrated that even profound institutional failures could become foundations for systematic improvement. Speaking of judicial training, Harrison continued, we've received a request from the Federal Judicial Conference to present our reform model at their national conference. Apparently, federal judges are interested in adopting similar oversight and bias prevention protocols for federal courts. The invitation represented national recognition that Jefferson County's transformation had implications beyond local criminal justice. If federal courts adopted similar reforms, the impact could reach every corner of the American legal system. Marcus showed everyone a notification on his tablet, a news alert announcing that Jefferson County had been selected to receive the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's Institutional Justice Award for systematic reforms that had measurably reduced racial disparities in criminal justice outcomes. The ceremony is next month in Washington, he announced. They're specifically recognizing the collaboration between the prosecutor's office, the public defender, courthouse administration, and community oversight that made comprehensive reform possible. The recognition was particularly meaningful because it acknowledged that lasting change required partnership across all aspects of the justice system rather than isolated improvements in individual offices. Lisa pulled up a document on her laptop. A research study by the University of Southern California's Criminal Justice Department analyzing the effectiveness of Jefferson County's reforms compared to traditional approaches to addressing prosecutorial misconduct. The study concludes that our systematic approach achieved more substantial and sustainable change than jurisdictions that relied solely on individual accountability measures, she reported. They're recommending our model as a template for communities seeking to address institutional bias in criminal justice. The academic validation complemented practical success in demonstrating that Jefferson County's transformation represented genuine innovation in approaches to systematic reform rather than merely reactive damage control. As the meeting concluded, Roxanne reflected on the journey from that morning when she had stood as a defendant in Judge Caldwell's courtroom to this afternoon when she was coordinating nationwide criminal justice reform efforts. The personal experience of bias had motivated comprehensive institutional change that was now serving as a model for communities across the country. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. Implementing new protocols required extensive training, ongoing oversight, and constant vigilance against backsliding into old patterns. Some staff members had struggled to adapt to expectations of fairness and accountability. A few attorneys had left for jurisdictions where prosecutorial misconduct was still tolerated, but the overall result had been a justice system that served its community more effectively by serving it more fairly. Like and subscribe if you believe one person's courage can change entire institutions. Share this story with anyone who needs to see that systematic change is possible when we demand accountability over comfort. The call to action reflected the broader lesson of Jefferson County's experience. Institutional transformation was possible, but it required sustained effort, community engagement, and leadership willing to prioritize justice over convenience. 6 months later, Roxanne received a phone call that brought her full circle to that Tuesday morning in courtroom 4C. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield, this is Attorney General Patricia Williams. We have a situation in Madison County that requires your expertise. A federal investigation has identified patterns of judicial bias similar to what you encountered in Jefferson County. We'd like you to lead a systematic reform initiative that could prevent the need for more dramatic federal intervention. The request represented both recognition of Jefferson County's success and acknowledgement that systematic bias remained a challenge requiring ongoing attention. Justice might have been delayed for decades in many communities, but it was no longer being denied to those with the power to demand accountability. Attorney General Williams, I'd be honored to assist. When can we begin? The answer came without hesitation, reflecting Roxanne's understanding that the work of justice was never complete, only continuous. 3 years later, the legacy. The Jefferson County Courthouse bore little resemblance to the institution where Judge Caldwell had dispensed prejudiced justice for 25 years. Glass panels in the main lobby displayed real-time data on sentencing patterns, conviction rates, and community feedback scores, transparency that would have been unthinkable under the previous system's culture of secrecy and unaccountability. Roxanne stood in the renovated courtroom 4C, now presided over by Judge Maria Santos, observing a community justice session where local residents participated in discussions about how criminal justice policies affected their neighborhoods. The intimidating judicial bench had been replaced with a curved desk that brought the judge closer to participants, symbolizing accessibility rather than authority. Judge Santos, whose investigation of Caldwell's misconduct had led to her appointment as the county's first Latina judge, was facilitating a conversation between former defendants, community leaders, and court staff about effective alternatives to incarceration for nonviolent offenses. "Mr. Johnson," she was saying to a middle-aged black man who had completed community service rather than serving jail time for a shoplifting charge, "can you tell us how the community service program affected your perspective on taking responsibility for harmful actions?" The question exemplified the new approach to justice that emphasized healing and education over punishment and humiliation. Johnson's response, describing how working with elderly residents in nursing homes had helped him understand the broader impact of his choices, demonstrated the kind of genuine rehabilitation that was possible when the system focused on human transformation rather than mere deterrence. Lisa Fairmont, now director of Defendant Services, sat in the gallery taking notes for her upcoming presentation to the American Bar Association on community-centered criminal justice reform. Her office had processed over 3,000 cases since the reforms began, with recidivism rates dropping 47% compared to pre-reform statistics. Marcus Steele monitored the session from his position near the back, his role as Justice Oversight Committee Chair having evolved into something approaching Community Ombudsman for criminal justice concerns. His monthly reports to Chief Judge Harrison continued to identify concerning patterns before they became systematic problems, and his background as a longtime courthouse employee gave him credibility with staff members who might be tempted to revert to old practices. Samuel, now retirement eligible but choosing to continue working, moved through the gallery with quiet pride. His transformation from silent witness to systematic bias to active advocate for reform had made him a symbol of the cultural change that enabled lasting institutional improvement. Jenny Walsh sat in the press section, working on her follow-up book about communities that had successfully replicated Jefferson County's reform model. Justice Delivered, the National Movement for Criminal Justice Accountability, would document how the morning in Courtroom 4C had inspired systematic changes in over 200 jurisdictions across 37 states. The session concluded with Judge Santos announcing the next month's topic, Restorative Justice for Violent Crimes, a discussion about whether rehabilitation-focused approaches could be effective for serious offenses rather than just nonviolent violations. The willingness to consider fundamental questions about justice philosophy demonstrated how much the courthouse's intellectual climate had changed. As participants filed out, many stopped to speak with Roxanne, thanking her for reforms that had directly affected their families or communities. Their comments ranged from grateful acknowledgement of fair treatment they had received to relief that their children would grow up in a community where justice was administered equitably. "Chief Prosecutor," said Maria Gonzalez, whose son's drug possession case had been diverted to treatment rather than prosecution under the new policies, "before you came here, I was afraid of this building. Now I feel like it belongs to our community." The comment captured the essence of what had been achieved. Transformation of a justice system from an instrument of oppression to a mechanism for community healing and safety. Chief Judge Harrison joined Roxanne as they walked toward the building's main entrance, passing portraits of former presiding judges that now included a plaque acknowledging the continuing work of justice and the need for constant vigilance against bias and inequality in the administration of law. "Roxanne," he said, using her first name as he had since they became partners in systematic reform, "I received an interesting call today from the White House Office of Justice Programs. They want to nominate Jefferson County for the Presidential Award for Excellence in Criminal Justice Reform. The recognition would be meaningful, but Roxanne had learned that awards and accolades were less important than daily commitment to fair administration of justice. "Theodore, I appreciate the recognition, but our real measure of success is whether someone who looks like I did that morning in Caldwell's courtroom receives fair treatment today." They paused outside the courthouse, looking at the stone inscription above the main entrance, "Equal justice under law." The words that had once seemed like empty promises now reflected actual practices supported by policies, procedures, and cultural expectations that made equality more than aspirational. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Marcus hadn't recognized you, Patas?" Harrison asked. "Or if Jenny Walsh hadn't been there to record everything? How different things might be if the wrong combination of circumstances had prevented the truth from coming out." Roxanne considered the question seriously. The transformation of Jefferson County's justice system had required not just her position and authority, but also the courage of individuals willing to speak up, the presence of media to document misconduct, and the institutional leadership necessary to implement systematic change. "Theodore, that's exactly why we can't rely on chance to protect people's rights. The system has to be designed so that bias and misconduct are identified and addressed quickly, regardless of who's affected or who's watching. That's the real lesson from our experience. Systematic problems require systematic solutions. Her phone buzzed with a text from Attorney General Williams. Roxanne, the Madison County reforms you implemented have been so successful that we're now getting requests from 12 other counties for similar assistance. Can you recommend trained professionals who could lead similar efforts? The message represented both validation of their approach and the challenge of scaling successful reforms to serve larger populations. Jefferson County's transformation had proven that institutional change was possible, but each community would need trained leadership to navigate the complex process of cultural and policy reform. I have a recommendation for Attorney General Williams, Harrison said, reading the message over her shoulder. There's a young prosecutor in our office who's been leading bias training sessions for law enforcement agencies across the region. Alan Brightwater has become quite an effective advocate for reform. The suggestion was particularly meaningful because Brightwater's journey from silent complicity in Caldwell's courtroom to active leadership in justice reform demonstrated the kind of institutional transformation that made systematic change sustainable. People could learn, grow, and become part of solutions rather than remaining part of problems. They walked to the parking area where Roxanne's car waited, the same vehicle that had received the parking ticket that started everything 3 years ago. The citation had long since been dismissed, and the ticket had become a symbol of how small incidents could reveal large systemic problems when people had the courage to demand accountability. You know, Harrison reflected, sometimes I wonder if Caldwell's behavior was actually a gift to our community. Not because bias is ever acceptable, but because it was so blatant that it couldn't be ignored or rationalized away. It forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about how our system really worked. Roxanne unlocked her car, considering the observation. Theodore, I'd prefer to think of it as a wake-up call that we were finally ready to answer. The bias was always there. What changed was our willingness to acknowledge it and do something about it. As she drove away from the courthouse, Roxanne reflected on the journey from defendant to chief prosecutor to national advocate for criminal justice reform. The experience had taught her that justice was not a destination but a process, a daily commitment to treating every person with dignity and ensuring that institutional power served community safety rather than individual prejudice. Her phone rang as she reached the first traffic light, another county requesting assistance with systematic reform efforts. Another opportunity to help transform a justice system from an instrument of bias into a mechanism for community healing. Chief Prosecutor Thornfield speaking, she answered. How can we help? The conversation that followed would lead to another community transformation, another group of citizens gaining confidence in their justice system, another demonstration that accountability and fairness were not just idealistic goals but practical necessities for effective law enforcement. The final reflection. 5 years after that Tuesday morning in Courtroom 4C, the story of Judge Caldwell's downfall and Jefferson County's transformation had become legend in criminal justice reform circles. Law students studied the case as an example of how individual courage could catalyze institutional change. Civil rights organizations cited it as proof that systematic bias could be identified, documented, and eliminated through sustained effort and community engagement. But for Roxanne Thornfield, the most meaningful legacy wasn't in the awards, recognition, or academic studies. It was in the knowledge that someone who looked like her could walk into any courtroom in Jefferson County and expect to be treated with dignity and fairness. That Tuesday morning had started with a parking ticket and a prejudiced judge who couldn't see beyond the color of her skin. It had ended with the recognition that justice delayed is not justice denied when institutions have the courage to acknowledge failures and implement systematic reforms. The lesson was simple but profound. Individual acts of courage, when supported by institutional leadership and community engagement, could transform even the most entrenched systems of bias and inequality. Justice might be slow, but it was ultimately inexorable when people demanded accountability over comfort, fairness over convenience, and truth over institutional protection. Justice may be delayed, but it will never be denied when we have the courage to demand accountability. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe that systematic change is possible when individuals refuse to accept injustice quietly. The call to action reflected the broader truth that Jefferson County's transformation had revealed. Change was not only possible but inevitable when enough people decided that the status quo was unacceptable and were willing to work together to create something better. The parking ticket that had started everything still sat framed in Roxanne's office, stamped with "Dismissed," issued in error, in red ink that had never faded. But the real error that had been corrected wasn't the citation. It was a system of justice that had forgotten its fundamental obligation to treat every person with equal dignity under law. That error had been systematically identified, comprehensively addressed, and permanently corrected through the kind of sustained institutional reform that turned one morning's injustice into a foundation for lasting change. Sometimes the most important victories begin with the simple refusal to accept that prejudice and bias are natural features of human institutions, rather than correctable flaws that can be eliminated through persistent effort and unwavering commitment to justice. In Jefferson County, that refusal had transformed everything.